On to South Africa. Eskom is looking for cheap long-term funding in order to move away from coal-fired power. The firm says it's had fruitful discussions with Western climate envoys. Climate envoys from the UK, the US, Germany, France visited South Africa several weeks ago, and they held talks about ways to support the country's transition to less polluting sources. South Africa is the world's 12th largest carbon emitter. It said at the time that it needed major financial support from wealthy nations in order to accelerate its shift away from coal. And it says it wanted an irrevocable agreement that could be signed at the COP26 climate summit next month. Eskom supplies more than 90% of the power used in Africa's most industrialized nation. Most of that comes through burning coal at its 15 coal-fired power stations. All right, then let's explore the details of how this transition might work with Thabo Sibeko, a program officer at the anti-coal campaign at Earthlife. Thank you for your time this evening. So Eskom says they need about $27 billion. That's roughly 400 billion rand in order to phase out its coal power plants. But do we have any more concrete details on how that phase out would happen and what generation sources would replace coal?
Yes, good evening. Good evening to your viewers as well. Yeah, I think a just transition to a low carbon development is a viable option as a move that countries, even the European countries, have actually adopted in order to replace coal to a much better viable options to generate energy in South Africa as well as other countries. So renewable energy is one of reliable technology which is actually adopted by so many countries, and South Africa is one of the countries that is actually has to move away from coal. I think the time has come now that Eskom should actually begin to move away from this kind of way of generating energy to a much more sustainable way, which will be able to save people's health as well as the environment. So renewable energy sources such as your solar panels, solar PV, hydro, and many others which are more sustainable is actually most recommended to replace coal.
But who should pay for that transition? Because we've heard promises in Paris when the Paris Climate Agreement was agreed to that, yes, we're going to provide at least $100 billion in funding from these same Western countries a year by 2020. That money is clearly not materialized. So can South Africa make that transition purely by domestic capital?
Yeah, I think South Africa is actually, by the willingness of the decision makers, government, I think it's very, very much possible. I mean, if you look at the how Eskom currently is actually generating an energy, and just a few years ago, Eskom has actually asked its consumers to actually pay more for electricity, which that on its own, it tells you that Eskom is actually able to generate enough revenue to be able to, implement a just transition to low carbon development. But also our government is actually has got a major role to play in funding the just transition to a low carbon development. Like recently now, they are now talking about a just transition fund, which is a fund that will actually allow the just transition to take its course in a more comfortable manner, particularly also just to also accommodate those that are willing to actually move away from the current way of generating energy or electricity by using coal. So by willingness of our government and the politicians, I think it's very, very much possible, and resources and funds would actually be made available to fund that.
Just a quick follow-up on that, because Eskom has raised its tariff and it's currently struggling to essentially stay on top of that massive amount of debt that it has. As part of that transition, would it be acceptable to you for South African taxpayers to essentially bail out Eskom, to take on some of that debt service in order to give it the fiscal room it needs to invest in cleaner sources of power?
I don't think it will be fair for South Africans to actually bail out Eskom at the moment, up until it's actually clear on their side that the resources which actually were lost during as the Eskom was functioning or is functioning.
You're referring to the looting that was taking place under the Guptas?
Yeah, I don't think for South Africans it's pretty much fair to bail out Eskom at the moment. I think the resources which were lost due to corruption and all that should actually be brought back first. And decision moving forward could be taken from there. But without those resources coming back, I don't think it's very, very much fair to say South Africans must actually bail out Eskom at the moment, because even currently, Eskom is actually planning and is actually implementing the so-called unbundling, and it's still not clear. The public is not aware. People, ordinary, people on the street, they are not aware that this is actually happening. So I don't think it's fair to go back to them and say, because Eskom is actually currently undergoing this difficult moment, ordinary citizens should actually be, we're bailing out Eskom. And if you look at also the amount of money that people are paying due to tariff hikes, I could say that already they are already, doing that, even though they are not aware. But, to say that there has to be a separate process which, people are actually following to bail Eskom, I don't think it's actually fair, for ordinary citizens.
Okay, one last question for you. We're getting closer and closer to COP26. From your perspective, what are the specific goals that South Africa should get when it walks onto the negotiating table at COP26, particularly in terms of funding, but also defining what acceptable emission offset should be?
Yeah, I think South Africa is one country that is actually good in terms of policy making and policy formulation. I think what I would like to see, something that is we are all, looking for as an outcome from the COP26 is that more action should be taken. Those implementation of the policies which are in place. Currently, South Africa has got a national determined contribution. We've got an integrated resource plan, and we've got also an energy plan in South Africa. And very little of those documents or policies are implemented. So what we are hoping for is that from the COP26, an acceleration of the just transition to low carbon development should actually take place at the moment, because very little is actually happening, despite the adverse effect of climate change that we already starting to see taking place in the neighborhood countries as well as South Africa. So we want acceleration of the just transition to take place out of the COP26. South Africa should be forced to actually begin to move away from the current system and the current ways of generating electricity to a much more better and a viable option and sustainable that will accommodate everyone and that will be able to also save the environment.
Okay, we'll leave it there for the time being. Tambo Sibeko, Program Officer, Anti-Coal Campaign at EarthLife.